Good morning and namaste, everybody. I'm very delighted to have a special guest today. This morning, we have Eleonora Beier, a postdoc student at UC Davis, and she's going to talk about her research that she conducted for her PhD a few years ago. And a part of that research study was Hindustani music. And that's how I got involved in this project, and I did whatever help I could provide. So let me tell you a little bit about Eleonora Beier, or Nora. She is a postdoctoral scholar at University of Davis Center for Mind and Brain. She conducts experimental research in psychology and cognitive. Let me go to my notes here on my computer. She conducts experimental research in psychology and cognitive neuroscience, exploring the ways humans understand language and enjoy music. In her current research, she uses electroencephalography, EEG, to study how our brains predict when we should pay attention as someone is talking and when we can mind wander. So this session is going to be really exciting. Let's find out all about her research. And let me change the view so we can see our guest. Welcome, Nora.
It's so nice. Thanks so much for having me.
Sure, it's a delight. We haven't seen each other for a few years. Have it been 5 years?
Yeah, it's been surprisingly really long, but it feels like it wasn't that long ago.
Right. And you published your PhD thesis in 2020. Am I right?
Yeah, it actually wasn't my thesis yet. It was just a first project that I did during my PhD. Okay. So yeah, that was published in 2020, and that's the study that we'll mostly talk about because it's the one about music.
Okay, wonderful. Yes, it was, I think we met a couple of times, and it was really nice to get to know you a little bit and to get to know your work. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of your project, what is your connection to music? I know you originally are from Italy, and then you came here to UC Davis to study psychology and do PhD. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I guess music has always been very important in my life. Part of that is that my dad is a professional musician, and my mom has taught music for many years. So music was kind of always around when I was growing up. Since my parents are kind of a classically trained musicians, I mostly was exposed to Western classical music during my childhood. So that was kind of like the main genre that I grew up with. But then I started kind of branching out and realizing, oh, there's so much other good music out there. And yeah, in college, I took a lot of music related classes. And I think one class that really stood out to me was ethnomusicology. So that's where I started learning a lot more about different traditions from different parts of the world. Yeah, and that led me to want to study music from the psychological point of view, which is kind of the interest that I developed in college to do psychological research. And I started thinking, oh, wouldn't it be nice to study, the psychology of music? And then I realized, oh, there's a whole field of people that study this. But that field was mostly centered on Western music again. And so since I started, getting interested in music from around the world, I was, okay, how about we do a study looking at the psychology of music, but with a cross-cultural perspective, and looking at how people perceive music when they are familiar with a certain style versus when they're not familiar with that style and with that whole tradition. And that's basically what led me to do this type of project for my PhD. So I came to Davis partly because one of the professors that works at Davis that I did this project with is one of there's not that many researchers that study music from a psychological perspective. And so I applied to work with him, and that's what brought me to Davis.
Wonderful. Good to hear about your background. I also got into music because my mother was a musician. Indian music was all around me when I was growing up in India.
Mhm.
So, do you play any instruments, or do you sing, or what do you do?
I've played the piano for most of my life, although I haven't been very good at keeping it up in recent years, just with all the work going on. But I took a lot of piano lessons, and I used to sing in choirs as well. So it's kind of some of my musical background.
Okay. So, when did you come to the United States?
I came for college. I went to college in New York State. Yeah, so I guess it was in 2012. Yeah, as soon as I finished high school.
Okay. So you already mentioned, what made you come to UC Davis. Um, what prompted you to choose this topic of chills brought about by different types of music? How cultural music affects different ethnicities. You touched a little bit upon that, but could
Sure.
you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what I was really interested in was basically how our musical background, like what we've experienced, the music that we grew up, how that influences our emotional responses to music. And like I mentioned before, most of the research in this field, at least when I started this, now it's actually a little bit better, but when I had started this, it was very Western centric. So people were studying how music leads to people to have these very strong emotions, but mostly looking at it with Western music. And so I wanted to see, in my personal experience, and also just from talking to other people, it seemed that it's true that maybe being really familiar with a certain musical style definitely influences how you perceive it and what kind of emotions you get from it. But in my experience, I could still feel emotional responses even to music that I had never heard before, and music from other cultures where I didn't really know the context of like why, or like is this music that is performed in a concert hall or in like a social gathering setting. There's so many kind of cultural aspects of music, and even without knowing all of that, I could still perceive some emotion, even though that was kind of against the current theory at the time that I started this project, where it says like you're supposed to really know, have a lot of experience with that music to feel anything. And so I kind of wanted to prove it wrong. And that's what led me to do this project. And in particular, I was interested in chills, which is when you get this kind of shiver down the spine when you listen to music, because it seemed like a type of emotional response that it's really, really intense. It's a very strong, pleasurable response, but it's not necessarily tied to a specific emotion. So it's not necessarily a sad or a happy response. And so it's something that's almost kind of pure in that way. And yeah, so that's why I wanted to see if people could get chills to music that they had never heard before from a different culture. And yeah.
So how are chills different than goosebumps? When you are excited and you get goosebumps for different emotions. And I know chills are they go down your spine and things like that. So how are they different?
They're actually like pretty similar. Like sometimes they can kind of happen together. So sometimes when people have measured chills, they actually measure goosebumps as well. And there's different ways to measure these things. Of course, you can ask people to report when they're feeling a chill or when they're feeling goosebumps. And that's one of the ways that I used in my study. Like people press the button as soon as they felt a chill. But you can also measure them physiologically. So there are ways to literally measure like how much goosebumps you have on your skin. And the way that I measured them physiologically was using skin conductance, where you put these electrodes on the palm of your hand. And basically, the more kind of excited you get, the more sweaty your hands become, just kind of naturally. You don't even realize that. But with the skin conductance measure, we can literally measure in real time how sweaty your hands are. And so that's a pretty good measurement of how excited you are emotionally. And so that's how we measured chills, both with self-report, and physiologically.
Mhm. All right, very good. Could you describe your project a little bit in more details? Like, I know you had Hindustani music, which is the Indian classical music, as part of your study. And that's where I helped you select some really, brilliant pieces by maestros. And you had some other, you had Western music also, maybe Chinese music. Could you a little bit describe your project for me?
Yeah.
For audience?
Yeah, so as you said, I had those three styles of music: the Hindustani classical music, traditional Chinese music, and Western classical music. And so that allowed me to have three groups of participants that were each familiar with one of those three styles, but not the other. Western classical music, we selected a group of people that specifically like Western classical music, but we assumed that all participants had a little bit of familiarity with it because they all lived in the US. But with the other two styles, the Hindustani music and the Chinese music, we could really have a group of people that was familiar only with the Hindustani music, but not the Chinese music, and vice versa. And that would allow us to test if they had the same amount of emotional responses to these different styles, or if they got more chills to the music from the style that they were more familiar with. And so, yeah, basically we had these participants come into our lab and listen to a whole series of these pieces. We didn't actually use the entire pieces. We had to cut them to 2-minute segments. Otherwise, it would take too long. But we had
you just use the part where there were crescendos and things like that, or where it really got fast, the music got fast?
Yeah, and that's where consulting with you and other experts in the other styles is super useful, because we had to select, okay, where in this long piece do we actually, which section do we make people listen to? So we had to have some input from people that are really familiar with that style. Okay, where's the part that's the most emotional? And so we selected those segments to be the ones to be used in the study. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and an additional thing that is actually really important into it was we needed to have a control condition, meaning we needed to have parts of the experiment where we expected people to not get chills, or to have very, very few chills, to have a comparison. And so we also used scrambled versions of those same pieces. So imagine taking the piece, and then you cut it in tiny little segments, and you move them all around, scrambling them. And so the result is something that sounds pretty horrible. And so we had people listen to those as well. And then we compared how many chills they got to the music across styles, and comparing the normal intact music to the scrambled music.
I can share my experience from attending a Western music concert. Last month, Andrea Bocelli was traveling through Sacramento, and then I attended his concert, and it was so amazing. So unlike the Indian music, this was kind of, it shook my core, because he's a tenor, right? Andrea is a tenor. And I really felt, when the music started, and then each piece would, start building this crescendo, and then it would, end in this big bang kind of thing. And when, it was just touching my heart and kind of piercing my heart in a good way. Um, and he was conveying a wide spectrum of emotions, from joy and excitement to sorrow and longing also, I felt at certain points. And I've just, left the concert in such an awe, feelings of awe, beauty, and, so many transcendent emotions were there. Really, really great. He's a very charismatic artist also.
Yeah. Did you feel like you had any chills during the performance?
Exactly right. Yes. Yes. And that was my first time. I think I attended a Western classical concert. We did some popular pieces during his concert, but mostly it was classical music. And I usually go for Indian music, listening to Indian music most of the times when there are concerts, because I'm an Indian musician. But it was really, really nice to break the mold and do something different and hear this wonderful, great artist.
Yeah, sometimes I wish people did that more often, actually, going a little bit outside of their comfort zone and trying something different. So
I like other world music. Like I really love Latin music, African music. So I listen to it on YouTube from time to time. But attending a concert in person is a different experience. It's a very elevating experience.
yeah.
So I think you touched a little bit about the results of your study. Can you elaborate that a bit more?
Yes. Yeah, so as I mentioned, we were looking at how many chills people got, comparing the different musical styles and comparing the intact to the scrambled music. And so what we found is that overall, people got more chills to the intact than the scrambled music, which, I mean, it is kind of, if we didn't find that, I would be very surprised. So obviously, scrambling and ruining kind of the structure of the music makes it so that people don't feel as much emotion. But when comparing the musical styles to each other, there was no difference in how many chills people got. So no matter what their background was, the three groups of participants, each familiar with each of these three styles, they have the same amount of chills to the three different styles during the experiment. And so that was really striking, because I even kind of expected that maybe they would get more chills to the music that they were familiar with, but we really didn't see that. And another really interesting aspect of the results is that we did a sort of acoustic analysis of the music to see, kind of like what you said before, that it seems like often, for example, the music has like this crescendo and it's like building up, and you get like the chill, like at the kind of top of that crescendo. And so we were looking, is that what's leading to chills across the different styles? Is there a consistency in where during the music people are getting chills? And there was. And the acoustic aspects of the music that led to chills were also the same across the styles. So even though these three styles, they have very different musical rules, they have different tonalities, they all use similar acoustic ways of inducing emotion. So that, for example, when there was a peak in loudness across the styles, that's where people felt the most chills. And so to me, that shows that even though there clearly are cultural differences in how music is produced and how people perceive it, there's still some universal aspect of how it induces emotion through these very kind of deep acoustic elements.
What was your own personal experience? How did you react to the Hindustani music and the traditional Chinese music? You of course, very familiar with Western music.
Mm-hmm.
What was your own experience with the two styles?
Yeah, well, I had a lot of fun preparing the stimuli for this experiment, because it involved me listening to a lot more of the music than what actually ended up going in the experiment. Because I listened to the whole pieces, and I think we even started out with like several pieces, and then I narrowed it down to ones that were the most emotional. And it was really, really fun to like learn about like the different instruments, and I definitely felt a lot of emotions listening to them. And it was also really interesting when we were discussing the pieces, and you were telling me about kind of the structure of them, and how, like, what kind of emotions they're meant to induce, and comparing that to the emotions that I was feeling kind of just on my own without knowing all of this background. So it was definitely very, very interesting, and I discovered a lot of new styles that I didn't know before.
So did you include those kinds of things also when you published the paper?
In terms of the, sorry?
In terms of, the styles, different styles of music, what you learned through your, during your study, what you learned about different styles and different cultural, music from different cultures. Did you also include that in your study?
So I included a lot of information about the specific pieces that were selected, including like the instruments and a little bit of the background. I didn't go into too much detail because the study was meant for like this kind of psychology journal. And so they don't want you to go on too many tangents. But I remember, right now, it's been a while since I read the paper, but also looking a little bit into across cultures, like whether there even is a concept of chills, or whether that's like a Western idea. And so doing some reviews of literature looking at that, and like different ways that different cultures even conceptualize of like strong emotional responses to music.
Okay, wonderful. So how I would like to find out, and the audience would like to find out, is there any application to your findings? How do you think you will use these findings?
Yeah. So the kind of short answer is that this is like a kind of very basic science experiment. So in a way, it's like a purely kind of scientific or theoretical question of asking, like, can music express emotion across cultures? And so it doesn't have like a super obvious application in that sense. But what I think is an application down the line, or just in general, is opening up the study, the psychological study, and even scientific study of music to not only Western music, but having this cross-cultural perspective, and seeing music as a human capacity. And so to really understand it in that way, we need to understand how music induces emotion, and just provides meaning to people's lives in different cultures, in different contexts, and what aspects translate across cultures. And yeah, I think in the past few years, that has become much more common than it used to be when I first started this project. And I hope that this study kind of contributed to that as well.
Wonderful to hear that. I think because of the pandemic also, the world became smaller, right? When everything was, being relayed online, I think a lot of people have had a lot of exposure to, lots of different things, because we were all in the same boat. And so many concerts were happening online, which were absolutely free. I think people were more exposed, I think, to different cultures and different styles of music.
Mhm.
So the last question I have for you is, what are you doing currently? And you are a postdoctoral student at UC Davis,
Mhm.
the Department of Brain and Mind and Brain.
Mhm.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So yeah, I finished my PhD last year, and started doing this postdoc, which I'm going to be doing for the next couple of years still. And basically, during my PhD, I was doing this research on music, but I also started researching language. And part of that is that there's a lot of connections between music and language. one of the things that I'm very interested in, and one of the things that I'm starting to look into right now, are the similarities in the rhythm of music and language. So, for example, also to bring in cross-cultural studies, it is not exactly what I'm doing right now, but one of the things that informs my research, it's been shown that the rhythms that are common in musical styles around the world often reflect the rhythms of the language that's spoken there. So yeah, different languages have kind of different types of rhythms. And so I'm interested in looking how these rhythms in the language are important for us to understand spoken language. So as we're listening to someone speak, how we use these rhythms to be able to predict when we should pay attention, for example. And so I'm studying that using EEG, which is where we record brainwaves. And it turns out that our brainwaves synchronize or appear to synchronize with these rhythms, both in music and in language. And so one of the things that I'm interested in studying further is also looking at whether it's really through the same types of neural and cognitive mechanisms that we synchronize to the beats of music and language, or if those are different but related processes. So yeah, those are some of the things that I'm currently studying.
Wow. I know that the rhythm is a part of our lives, because our heartbeat, our heart beats all the time. And so the rhythm is there in our bodies. It's inherent in us. And also I feel that, the music is so powerful. As you mentioned, how language and music are connected. I think before a child starts speaking, he starts singing,
Yeah.
or whatever, some sounds that a baby produces. And personally, I feel that music is a medium to connect to the high, because it just transports you to another world, which is not this physical plane.
Mm-hmm.
In many ways, music is extremely powerful and very healing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of the things that's interesting about the differences between music and language, that sometimes language is almost too concrete. I mean, maybe poetry is a little bit more abstract, but you need to have a very specific meaning when you come up with a sentence. But with music, it is a lot more up to interpretation, and it can bring you to a whole other world and make you experience things without knowing exactly what you're experiencing. So I find it really interesting that there are definitely similarities, but at the same time, there are like very strong differences as well.
That's right. I was just wondering, do you do any performances? Do you go out and do public performances, or you just practice at your own home?
No, I used to do like recitals when I used to take classes, but I haven't done that more recently. So I try to bring it forward and do it at home, but sometimes it's hard to to do that.
When you go back home to Italy, are you planning to do anything with, particularly with music?
I'm not sure. I'm actually leaving for Italy as soon as we finish this conversation, which is kind of funny. But I'll mostly be traveling, so I don't know if I'll. That's the only bad thing of playing the piano is that you can't bring your instrument with you.
That's true.
So yeah.
Yes. Yes, it's yeah. Okay, so I'm so glad we had a chance to talk today and get to know about your research and connect to music. We had celebrated World Music Day on June 21st, but for some reason, I couldn't put this session together. But I'm so glad that we could meet today. And my best wishes are with you, Nora. And let's keep in touch. And maybe we could do something together, like a performance or something. I could invite you, and you could showcase your talent.
I would love that. Thanks so much. It was so nice to see you again after all these years.
Okay, Nora, all the best.
Thank you. You too.
Next time, see you soon. Have fun in with your family.